For hundreds of years, candles were the primary source of light for people all across the world. And like any highly sought-after commodity, there was big money to be made by those who could produce them. But when it comes to candle making, one material was so sticky that medieval candle makers had to make some serious sacrifices to keep their hands on this lucrative trade. So, why was candle making such a sticky situation in the Middle Ages? To understand why medieval candle makers went through such great lengths to keep their hands unstuck, we first have to understand just how candles worked. Candles may seem pretty straightforward, but before the Industrial Revolution, candles weren't just simple wax cylinders with a wick stuck in the middle. In fact, there were many different ways to make candles throughout history. In the Middle Ages, most candles were made from tallow, which is rendered beef fat. This tallow would then be mixed with a type of grease called along with a little bit of beeswax or spermaceti, which came from sperm whales. Then the mixture would be boiled to separate out the different components, and the remaining liquid was what was used to make the candles. The liquid would be poured into molds where it would cool into long, solid blocks of candle material. And while this may sound gruesome today, tallow candles were actually very popular because they burned brighter than other types of candles and gave off less smoke. However, the downside of tallow candles was their consistency. Because they were made from animal fats, each batch was slightly different, and if the mixture wasn't done properly, the candles could end up too soft or too hard. If they were too soft, the candles wouldn't hold their shape and would end up melting all over the mold. But if they were too hard, the candles would crack while cooling and be ruined. Getting the right consistency was tricky enough as it was. But even if the candles were made properly, the next part of the process was even more challenging. Once the candles had cooled in their molds, they needed to be removed. The problem was, candles made from tallow were so sticky that they adhered to the sides of the mold so well that they could be easily taken out. To solve this problem, medieval candle makers used molds made from special types of wood that were less likely to stick. They also coated the insides of the molds with various substances to prevent the hot candle material from sticking to them. Some common materials used to coat the molds included sawdust, plaster, leather, resin, and bones. But even with these precautions, the candles still stuck. So once the candles had hardened off, the mold would be put into a water bath to help loosen them up. Then a metal tool called a candle knife would be used to try and slice the candles away from the sides of the mold. But even with all of these methods, the candles were so sticky that the candle makers often got their hands stuck inside the molds. The worst part was that getting your hand stuck didn't just mean an unpleasant scraping sensation. It meant your entire arm was now covered in hot candle material, which would quickly melt into your skin and burn you badly. As you can imagine, being burned by hot candle wax wasn't just painful, but could also result in permanent dark scarring. And considering that candle making was a trade that required your hands to be quick and dexterous, it goes without saying that lots of candle makers ended up with some very unfortunate and noticeable scars. It's no wonder then that medieval candle makers did everything they could to prevent their hands from getting stuck in the candle molds. One way they did this was by covering their hands in some type of protective coating, usually a type of cream or salve. By covering their hands with something slick, the candle makers reduced the surface area of their skin that was exposed to the hot candle material, thus reducing the amount of wax that could get stuck to them. Another method candle makers used was to wear long gloves while working with the hot candle material. These gloves weren't just for protection though. The heat from the candles would often make the molds warp and buckle, which could cut into the candle maker's hands if they weren't careful. Gloves helped protect them from cuts as well as burns. However, these gloves weren't the type you might picture a medieval candle maker wearing. For protection against the hot wax, the candle makers wore heavy leather gloves that reached up to their elbows. These thick leather gloves were necessary because if a candle maker got burned, the thicker the material between their skin and the hot wax, the less likely it was that the wax would burn them. But while these gloves protected their hands, they weren't very practical for making candles. Candle making was a delicate process that required precise movements, not to mention lots of dexterity. So it est no surprise that candle makers wanted to shed these bulky gloves. When it was time to actually make the candles, this meant that every time a candle maker dipped his hand into a mold full of hot candle material, he was taking a gamble. If he was quick, he could successfully scrape the candles out without getting stuck. But if he made a mistake, he risked getting burned badly and being stuck with horrible scars that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Candle making wasn't the only job that left people with unwanted scars. 4 more ways medieval workers injured themselves. Check out what was the most dangerous job in the Middle Ages, or watch this video instead.